What event felt normal at the time, but ended up haunting you to this day? This was longer than I thought it'd be. TL, doctor at the bottom. My mom has epilepsy, it's totally under control with medication and she hasn't had a seizure in years. Anyway, when we were little, she always told my siblings and I what to do in case she had one. Seizures can cause temporary memory loss, so we would answer her questions when she came to, time her seizures, things like that. My dad died a month or so before my 12th birthday and her doctor prescribed an antidepressant temporarily and told her if it interfered with her current medications, they'd need to change the dosage. She could always feel them coming on, and one day when we were home together, she called me into her room because she was about to have one. When she came to, she was confused as usual and asked questions. What day it was, what time it was, how long was the seizure. Then she asked a question that I wasn't sure how to answer but thought it best to be honest. She asked where my dad was. I was still grieving. This was probably a month to 6 weeks after he died, so it made me cry, but I remember the exact words I said. Mom, Dad died. I had to break the news to my mom that her husband of 14 years was dead as if it was the first time. She immediately started sobbing, asking what happened, when it happened, was I okay, where were my siblings, were they okay? I'm tearing up just thinking about it. It broke my heart and I never want to break news like that to her again. She only had one seizure after that and they figured out the balance of her meds. When she asked where my dad was, I just told her he was at work. She slowly remembered what happened and it was a much less painful experience for both of us. TL, doctor, 12-year-old kid has to break the death of father to epileptic mother due to temporary memory loss after a seizure. When I was about 12 we got some new neighbors. They had a huge family with a couple kids my age and this one guy. I'd say in his late 20s. We had a pool in our backyard that I would often swim in. The guy would sometimes shout at me while I was in the pool asking me to bring his basketball back because it would in our backyard. He didn't speak much English so he was hard to understand. Oftentimes he would stare at me while I was outside, and he would even bring a chair over to the fence and watch me swim. I never thought anything of it. My grandma and stepdad would occasionally do that when the younger children played in the pool. He would also sing to me when I was outside. I always felt like an outcast with my family, so I was happy that someone was paying attention to me. Years later, I am visiting my parents' house with my younger cousin who is 10. She is swimming in the pool and I step out to tell her lunch is ready, when I see the same creep walking over to the fence with the basketball in his hand and watch him casually toss the ball over the fence while my cousin's back is turned. And then he started shouting at her asking for the ball back. I shut that down real fast. Parents put a privacy fence up that next week. At the restaurant where I used to work, there were a group of us who always closed together. Once the restaurant locked its doors for the night, we would all go out back and smoke and bullshit for a little while, then we'd all go back inside and work together to knock out the closing duties so that we could leave for the night. One night, one of the girls who was a single mother of 2 young children and a notorious partier just kind of started talking to no one in particular, just kind of thinking out loud. She said, I had the weirdest dream last night. I dreamed that I woke up and there were these people standing around my bed, and they told me that I had one more chance. But if I didn't stop partying, they were going to take my kids away and give them to someone else to raise. She just kind of shivered, and no one really responded. She died of an overdose a week later. That was over 20 years ago, but I still think about it often. I was at a family thing and my aunt had brought her new boyfriend. He had apparently been in the Mexican military and had also done bodyguard jobs for important people down there. So I was fascinated by this. I showed him some of my guns, and tried to learn some kind of warrior knowledge off him. After some pestering, he finally said, okay, let's say you were bodyguarding for your aunt, where would you look for a threat? We were standing outside. I looked around as best as I could, and said something like, well, there could be like someone hiding in one of the parked cars, ducked down. He chuckled and was like, no. What about someone on the inside? Someone at this very party? The threat usually isn't from the outside, some stranger. The threat usually comes from within, from someone you thought you could trust. 6 months later I found out he was arrested and deported back to Mexico for conspiring to murder my aunt to get $40,000 somehow. Looking back on that conversation now, is fucking terrifying. My dad and his male relatives, including my grandfather, would always make really sexual comments and jokes around me and my female cousins. I assumed this was normal. As we got older it got worse. I got used to putting my hands over my backside to keep my skirt down so they couldn't put their hand up there. I felt so guilty because when I would tell them not to touch me they would get so angry and defensive and make it seem like I was the one in the wrong for being uncomfortable and turning a joke into something gross. It took a lot to get over that. When I was younger, I had a friend who lived 2 doors down in the duplex we lived in, and me and her would always play at my grandmother's house, who was right next door to mine. As we got older, I would see her less, and I would drive my play car down to her side of the duplex, and would knock asking for her to come out and play. Normally one of her brothers would answer, and never let me in, or look inside the house, and just say she's not home, but I would sometimes hear what I would think is her, or a show I know she would watch, and would highly doubt her brothers would watch. I rarely saw her after these events, maybe once or twice, and she was really quiet and never really wanted to play anything, just sit and watch TV. I truly just thought she was quieter and never really questioned it. After me and my family moved, I never saw her again, and learned a few years later that she was repeatedly raped by her 3 brothers, for a long span of her life. I have no idea where she is now. It bothers me because we were around 6 to 7 when we used to play and she stopped wanting to play as much when I was able to see her, and I keep thinking that maybe this was happening and I was literally right outside of her house. If I was a nosy little shit like I normally was and found out, maybe I could have said something or told someone. Got a knock on my door in my rural neighborhood when I was about 8. At the door was a lady that claimed that she had seen my dog in the next neighborhood over. Now, this in and of itself was fairly normal. We nicknamed the dog Houdini because of how good he was at escaping. Came to realize he could open doors and was just letting himself out. What was weird was we knew the dog's favorite places to go and none of them were in this direction. It was also way further than he would normally go. What also wasn't normal is her constant insistence that I get into her car to go look for the dog. I walked for 20+ minutes and this lady is following me in her car the whole way. Tiny, safe rural neighborhood, there was no risk, repeatedly trying to get me into her car. Dog wound up being in the complete opposite direction, where he normally goes. So, yeah. Didn't even tell my parents because I thought it was just a simple misunderstanding, but the more I think about it the more I realized I was likely targeted that day. When I noticed my dad still hadn't grabbed his usual 2 cups of ramen off the counter. He's very particular about grabbing and eating his cups as soon as the hot water's cooked them, but it had been over an hour and they were still sitting there. I didn't think much of it at the time and continued whatever I was doing. Probably 15 minutes later I get a text from my stepmom telling me to go check on my dad in his room. She'd just received a text from him that he couldn't breathe, he had a horrid headache and he couldn't get up from his bed. Long story short, he was rushed to the hospital and we later found out he had a stroke. If I hadn't called the paramedics when I did, he might have been treated too late and died. I still vividly remember my dad being in the hospital that night, the whole family being too terrified to sleep, and his 2 cups on ramen still on the counter. In my state we have a huge problem with wrong-way drivers crashing into people on the freeways. I came across one of those accidents right after it happened. I immediately parked behind it and started to help in any way I could until EMS and the highway patrol arrived. Once they got there I got back in my car and went home like everything was normal. I still think about it to this day, and it was probably 10 to 11 years ago. The female driver of the car going the correct way died on impact and was slumped over in her seat. The female in the passenger seat was crushed, could only see part of her leg and part of her head. You could tell she was still breathing. I don't know how she was still alive at that point. I found out later they used the jaws of life to cut her out of the car, but she died on the way to the hospital. Of course the drunk guy going the wrong way lived, like they always seem to. I was 9, and my mom and I had just gotten back from a long car trip. It was around 6 or 7 p.m. and starting to get dark. I was going through this phase where I loved playing basketball, and just wanted to shoot hoops to decompress from a long day. My mom let me play basketball by myself in the front driveway for a bit before I had to start getting ready for bed. While I was playing, there was this old beat-up car that drove on my street. When it would pass my driveway, it would slow down. I couldn't see the driver because the windows were dark. The car kept circling back to my house, slowing down each time it passed my driveway, then speed up again. After the 3rd time I saw it disappear from sight, I ran inside and went to my front window. I waited until the car came back a few minutes later. It slowed down, as usual, right by my house. When it saw I wasn't in the front yard, it sped away a lot faster than normal. I waited a few more minutes to see if it would come back, but it didn't. I didn't tell my mom at the time what happened, but thinking back, it haunts me to consider what would have happened if I didn't go inside. My mother homeschooled me for most of the first half my school years. She was awful, resorting to beating me and screaming if I had trouble understanding a question or lesson. She also would constantly remind my brother and I of bizarre sins we could be committing, such as playing violent video games or watching cartoons where the characters had fake voices or talking to girls when you get to high school because dating should only lead to marriage. Later on in life she started canning tons of food and making plans on what nearby reservoirs provide the best water. It wasn't until my adult years did I realize she was a fucking religious nut that was afraid they weren't teaching enough about God in school and it pissed her off, and believed Obama was the Antichrist and Illuminati figure who will destroy the world's economy. Now as an adult, I live with personal shame of my childhood, anxiety, and find myself confused about my faith and perception of life. I struggle in college and have a hard time socializing, and it honestly depresses me to the point where I lock myself in my car and weep. In high school, my house was the accidental target of a drive-by. Our next-door neighbor was a small-time drug dealer and I guess he pissed off the wrong people. I was on the phone with a friend when it happened and just moved behind a door frame and kept talking. Our house was brick so nobody got hurt, but they did hit the driver door of my mom's SUV. The one bullet that hit the intended house entered through a downstairs window and struck a wall directly above a crib where a baby was sleeping. The drug dealer's house was a duplex and he lived upstairs. The family downstairs were just renting and had no connection to him at all. My friend liked to joke that I was a stone-cold badass, but the truth was that I was simply used to the sound of gunshots in my part of town and hadn't really processed what had happened until much later. I still think about that bullet hole above the crib and how much worse it could have been had the shooter aimed slightly lower while randomly firing. In elementary school, we had this really funny, overall chill old dude as our teacher. But the thing is, he always wanted to sit in the girls' locker room while we changed, and watch us. He jokingly said that he was just making sure we were good, and at the time nobody really thought about it that much. He was just the funny dude, you know? A couple of years later, when I was in high school, I heard from an old elementary school friend that he got arrested for raping a young girl. Looking back, this shit disgusts me. The fact that no other teacher noticed, or if they did they didn't tell anyone or do anything about it, still scares me. This shit is fucking illegal.